Hi, in this video I want to give you an introduction to the first chapter in our biology textbook, Chapter 1, A View of Life. And as you follow along, you should try to take notes, or you can take notes using your textbook as well. This is really just going to be an overview of the chapter. I won't go into a lot of details about some of these areas, and so you'll need to kind of follow along, read the textbook, complete the exercises in your MindTap assignments, and also refer to some of the other videos that are posted to the Moodle course. As we go through the notes, you'll see that there are several learning objectives. This is just kind of to give you an idea of some of the main topics that are important for this particular chapter. So, for example, the first learning objective for this chapter is to look at the three basic themes of biology. And those themes are listed here for you: evolution, information transfer, and the energy of life. What we'll do now is just kind of present these and define these terms, and then you'll see these later as recurring themes as we go through the semester. The first one is evolution. I think most everybody has an idea of what evolution is. It's simply where populations change over time. Something in their in their DNA allow them to change to be more accustomed to a particular and to adapt to a particular environment. That's change over time. So, for example, if you think about something as simple as a virus that adapts and changes so that it requires people to get a new flu vaccine each year, because during the year's time that particular strain or virus has adapted and has changed. Information transfer, how genetic information is being transferred. And there's four ways that are listed here: within cells, within organisms, among organisms, from one generation to another. And of course, the genetic information that we're really talking about here is your DNA and RNA. And so we're going to see these. We've got a whole unit that discusses genetics, some classical Mendelian type genetics, as well as molecular genetics that gets into DNA, RNA, what are genes, and gene transfer. We're also going to look at other topics later on, such as cellular biology. And so we'll see what is exactly inside of a cell and where is the genetic material located. Energy is another major theme of biology, because we all have to have some form of energy. Energy generally all comes from the sun to start with. It flows from the sun to the earth, and then it goes through kind of a series of organisms to begin with the producers, primary producers, and then eventually to consumers, as we are. And so we'll see a little bit. This is really what's called ecology. And so we'll see some ecology along in some of the chapters as well. Learning objective number 2. What characteristics distinguish living organisms from non-living things? In other words, how do you know something is really alive? All right, why is a certain animal alive? That's pretty easy. Why is a particular plant? What about something like bacteria? Why is bacteria alive? What about a virus? Is a virus alive? And so in biology, they have set up a series of characteristics that allow biologists to understand if something is truly alive or not. These characteristics are listed here for you. Characteristics of life include growth and development. That's number 1. And so these aren't necessarily in any particular order, but that's one question to look at. If something is alive, then it should grow and it should develop. And we'll define some of these in just a minute. Self-regulated metabolism. Does it have a metabolism? Does it have chemical reactions taking place inside of that organism? Does it respond to external stimuli? And does it have capability to reproduce? And if living things are truly living, then they must satisfy each of these, all 4 of these criteria. We'll look at cell structure. This slide just shows a few things about the cell. And again, we'll have another chapter that goes into much more detail about the cell, what's on the inside. So, for example, a plasma membrane. This is a outer protective layer of the cell. It does surround the cell and does protect the cell. And it also, very importantly, protects and separates the cell from the external environment. Living things are made up of cells. Living things have genetic instructions, DNA. organelles. Living things are going to have organelles so that they can, carry out the metabolic type processes that we mentioned earlier. There's also two main types of cells, and again, we'll get into these a little more deeply in some of the other chapters, but prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Right? All of the different types of life you can separate as either a prokaryotic cell, which is here, or a eukaryotic cell. Early on, it's good to know what these words mean. If you see the prefix here, pro, that means before. Pro means before. The ending here, keri, refers to, sorry, it's getting a little messy here, refers to nucleus. And so what this technically word is telling us is that these cells have developed before the formation of a nucleus. In other words, they do not have a true nucleus. Right? There's two main groups of these of prokaryotic cells, and they're labeled as bacteria and archaea. Archaea is an ancient form of bacteria. Right? Generally, these are single-celled organisms, and they have no, this is very important, this is what distinguishes them mainly, they have no membrane-bound organelles, such as a nucleus or a chloroplast, maybe you've heard of that before, or a mitochondrion. Right? These are all membrane-bound organelles. Organelles, small organs that carry out some particular type of function that generally have double membranes around them. Well, prokaryotic cells don't have those types of organelles. They still have some organelles, they just don't have those that are membrane bound. And we'll talk more about those in later chapters. Eukaryotic cells, this is what we are. We have eukaryotic cells. And again, here the prefix EU refers to true. These have a true nucleus. Right, a true nucleus. So their organelles, most of them, are enclosed with true membranes. For example, the nucleus. It has a nucleus. It has mitochondria for energy. We have things called Golgi for transport and packaging. We have things called the endoplasmic reticulum for helping with protein configuration. Right? So we have many types of membrane-bound organelles. Now, another criteria for characteristics of living things is that organisms grow and they develop. Right? Growing means they grow in size, they increase in size. It gets larger, the cell gets larger. It can also indicate it grows in the number of cells. In other words, you start out with one cell, and that cell divides, and now you have two cells. And then each of those cells divides, and guess what? You'll have 4 cells. All right? Development is more than just growth, because development means that the cell actually changes. There's some type of changes or maturation process, and matures and develops along the way. Organisms regulate their metabolic processes. First of all, the definition for metabolism. Everybody's heard of metabolism. This is the biological definition for it. Chemical activities of the organisms. All of the different chemical reactions that are taking place inside of the organism. A lot of that has to do with the energy that we'll talk about later called ATP. All right, this form of energy, whether you're making this energy or using this energy for a chemical reaction, this is all part of a metabolism. Living things must have chemical activities inside. All right. Homeostasis, this is a great word. If you take an anatomy or physiology course, you'll talk quite a bit about homeostasis. And the key here is balance. Living things try to maintain a particular balance for that cell and that organism. Right? Keeping things in balance, that's homeostasis. Organisms respond to stimuli. Right? A stimulus could be some kind of physical or chemical change. It could either be internal or external. Think about a bright light. What happens whenever a bright light shines in your face? You usually react. You usually have some kind of stimulus. You may close your eyes. Your pupils may constrict. Right? You may move away. but that is some type of a stimulus. Living things have some type of response to these types of stimuli, either external or internal. All right. These little pictures here, this is showing some bacteria. This bacteria has flagella, little tail-like structures at the end, and these bacteria can respond to various stimuli and actually basically swim around in their environment. Everybody probably knows what this is. These are, of course, Venus flytraps, and if something enters that Venus flytrap, it causes, this would be an external type of a stimulus, it causes that plant to react and respond. Organisms reproduce. Organisms reproduce. It may be asexual reproduction. In other words, the cell, as indicated in this picture here, just divides. This is also known as binary fission. The cell divides, and so you basically have two identical cells from here and here. It's still reproduction, the cell divided, but most of the time you have very low genetic variability. In other words, these are just the same cells. That's different than sexual reproduction, because in sexual reproduction you have two parents that are contributing to the genetic makeup of the offspring. And so that increases the genetic variability, which is very important. All right, so both of these count as reproduction. And so again, all of these different criteria that we've seen here are criteria that are shared among living things. Then the question goes back to, what about viruses? Do viruses complete all of these characteristics? Well, I'm going to let you think about that and kind of decide for yourself. Viruses do reproduce, but they have restrictions on the reproduction. And so we'll talk a little bit more about viruses in other chapters as well. Learning objective number 3. What are the hierarchical levels of biological and ecological organization? In other words, how are living things organized? All right, how are living things organized? Well, you can organize based on the biological hierarchy, and that goes from smallest to largest. And so you start out with chemicals. That's the smallest part inside of our bodies. We're basically containers that have all these chemicals inside and all these chemical reactions that are taking place where? Inside of cells. Take cells together, like cells together, and you create tissues. Right? Take tissues and you form organs. Take organs and you form an organ system. And then eventually you take multiple organ systems and you create that organism. So again, if you studied anatomy, you may talk about the various chemicals that make up a particular cell. You may talk about the energy chemicals, the ATP, or the carbohydrates, or the proteins, or the lipids, the fats, or the nucleic acids. Right? You may talk about the different cell types, whether it's hepatocyte, a liver cell, a neuron, a nerve cell, like some type of a heart cell. You could talk about the cells then that make up those tissues. All right, there's different forms of tissues. It could be muscle tissue or nervous tissue. Then you could talk about the organ that gets made up here, whether it's a heart or liver, lungs. All right, then the organ system, circulatory system, lymphatic system, respiratory system, nervous system, and then all of the different systems of the human body make up that particular organism. Now, if you look at the ecological organization, that basically takes over where the organism levels leave off. So now you have the organism, all right? Organisms, in other words, the organism is a human. Humans live in populations. And then populations make up communities that include other types of organisms. Communities make up ecosystems. And then you have the biosphere, which is the largest of the ecological sections. Biosphere, meaning it contains all of the living parts. Bio means living. All of the living parts of that ecology. Learning objective number 4, what is the importance of information transfer to living organisms? Well, the DNA, it transmits information, genetic information, from one generation to the next. And again, we're going to see a whole chapter, a whole unit really, that discusses genetics. This just gives you an overview, a couple of things. You may know this already. DNA has 4 what are called nucleotides. Sometimes these are referred to as base pairs. There's 4 of these. You may have seen these: adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. These are the 4 nucleotide base pairs that formulate your genetic code. These also contribute to genes. You have a gene for blue eyes, or a gene for brown hair, or genes that go into the formulation of certain diseases or genetic disorders. These genes then code for various proteins, and that gives you various characteristics. This picture just shows you an example of a model of a DNA molecule, and again, we'll talk about more of this later, but this is basically it's called a double helix. In other words, there are 2 strands of nucleotides that are entangled. I'll try to draw a little bit of a double helix here, kind of entangled together, somewhat like that. Not exactly, but you kind of get the idea. 2 strands of nucleotides that are twisted in a helical shape, forming a double helix. All right, how is information transmitted? Well, it's transmitted in many different ways. This lists 4 proteins. Proteins we'll have in the next chapter. We'll talk, actually chapter 3, I think, we'll talk a little bit about the biochemistry, and we'll see some examples of proteins. But proteins allow for some information to be transmitted in a cell. Hormones are very important. Hormones, especially in A&P, we talk about the endocrine system and how different hormones carry out many functions inside of the body, and they carry much information throughout the cells and throughout the body. Cell signaling, this you can kind of think of as cell-to-cell communication. If these 2 cells here can actually send signals to each other and communicate through each other, right? And then neurotransmitters are chemical signals that are released from nerves. That's what the prefix here refers to, released from one nerve to the next. All right, one of the other concepts we'll look at eventually is evolution. We've already mentioned the definition. The theory of evolution is change over time, and then the processes by which these change over time. You'll see that a little later in the semester, and actually that's also covered in Bio 112. There are a few topics here that are related to evolution and evolutionary theory, and so we'll kind of look at these definitions: systematics, taxonomy, and species. Systematics is the study of organisms and their relationships. You can kind of think of this as looking at a family tree. If anybody's ever done any what we would call genealogy, if you've ever looked at your genealogy before, looked up your family tree, then basically you've kind of studied a little bit of systematics. All right. Many times now, systematics is done by looking at the DNA, comparing the DNA from one organism to another, or from one species to another, or even within species, within a population, and looking at population genetics. You can determine how things are related. It can also be done, and it is still done, through the morphology, studying the physical characteristics of that organism rather than the molecular characteristics. But either way, you're basically making some type of a family tree for that family. Taxonomy is all about naming and then categorizing. It's part of systematics, and so many scientists that are systematic scientists, they are part of taxonomy because they're interested in naming, whether it's a new species or correcting a name for a species that may have been categorized into the wrong category. Now, last here is the definition of a species. As you study biology, you'll find that there are different definitions for species, because this is not an all-inclusive definition listed here, but this is a good definition. Populations capable of breeding with one another, that constitutes one definition of species, and it's still a valid one. Learning objective number 5. What is the binomial system of nomenclature used to classify living organisms? One key word I want to bring your attention to is binomial. Binomial means two names. Bi means two, and nomial refers to names. And so each organism is given a two-name identification, a genus and a species. That's called the binomial system of nomenclature. Also, there is a hierarchy for this as well, and it is listed here for you. Domain is the top, then you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. All right, domain is the largest, the most broad portion of this classification scheme, and then you see the others listed here for you, and the last two that are part of the binomial system, genus and species. Now this table gives you some examples. It lists over here the domain, kingdom, and so forth, but also give you some examples where, for example, a cat would fit into this. All right, the cat would be part of the domain called Eukarya. Well, so would we, and so would white oak. All right. The other two domains, by the way, would include the prokaryotic organisms we mentioned before. So eukarya just means that we're all eukaryotes. All right? We all have a true nucleus, like we mentioned earlier. The white oak tree, humans, cats, we all share something in common because we're all eukaryotes, and so we're in the domain eukarya. What about kingdom? Well, cats belong to the animal kingdom. Well, so do we. But what about white oak trees? They're plants, and so they're part of the plant kingdom. All right? And then the next group, phylum. Well, phylum chordata. That means we have backbones, chordates. And so here, that's listed here again. We have a particular type of spinal cord. And so we have similarities there. But white oak trees don't have that, and so they have another category. And then it goes down and down and down. So what are the three domains and the six kingdoms of living organisms? Here are your domains. We've already mentioned mentioned all three of these, but here are these listed again. Bacteria, archaea, remember both of these are prokaryotic. From the term we learned earlier, they do not have a true nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. They, however, are distinct enough, different enough, that they have their own domain. Eukarya, which we are part of, are eukaryotic. We have a true nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. This lists the six major kingdoms: archaea, bacteria, protista, plantae, fungi, and animalia. Where do we belong? Of course, we belong here in the animal kingdom. This picture just shows you an example of what's called a phylogenetic tree here, or a cladogram is where you would put and relate all of the different kingdoms. So if you look close, the ones that are closer together, if on the ends of the tree they're closer together, that means they're more closely related. So these two would be more closely related than these, and these two are more closely related than something way out here or out here. So here's bacteria. Where are we? We're in the animal kingdom, so we are here. So this is bacteria. This is another type of bacteria. I'm going to put a B there too. That's another type of bacteria. Notice they're pretty far out there. The protist group, which we'll talk about later, this includes algae and some other unicellular type plant and animal-like cells. They're out here. These are your plants here. These are your plants here. Here's animals. Here's fungi. So it's very interesting to note that we animals are closer related to the fungi than the fungi are to the plants. So notice how far away those are versus how close we are. Learning objective number 9. What are the roles of producers, consumers, and decomposers in the flow of energy through the ecosystems? Energy for life. Energy is very important, and we'll talk a little bit about ecology. Life depends, of course, on some type of energy, and of course, ultimately, we get our energy from the sun. We have to have this energy because that sunlight provides energy for plants to go through the process of photosynthesis, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. And then we, in turn, use the energy that they produce in photosynthesis to make our own energy, and that we call ATP. This just shows you a little bit of a energy flow chart. You can kind of see what I just kind of mentioned. Here's your sunlight energy coming here. It's picked up by the primary producers, the plants. They produce energy through the process of photosynthesis. Then you have some other consumers that will eat the plant, and then maybe some additional consumers that eat either the plant or the animals that are eating the plants, and the cycle pretty much continues. Producers, make note of this definition here. Producers are also known as autotrophs. That's a good biological, ecological term to note. First of all, notice the prefix auto means self, and so these, anything in this category has the ability to produce its own food. So plants, of course, would be autotrophs. Right? They have the ability to go through photosynthesis, which is transforming light energy from the sun, into a chemical type energy, which the process is shown here in the equation for photosynthesis. CO2, you probably know what that is, carbon dioxide. Mix that with water, or H2O, provided that you have light energy, produces a range of sugars, including glucose. So I'll write your formula for glucose there, but other sugars as well. And then that gives off oxygen as a byproduct. And of course, we need that oxygen to go through what's called cell respiration to produce the energy ATP that we need. Now, kind of the opposite of autotrophs is heterotrophs. Hetero here means other, so these organisms have to use some other mechanism to produce food. So we don't produce food ourselves, so we have to consume food, consume energy. So we use the energy that's produced by the producers through a whole process called cellular respiration. Here is the energy for cell. Here's the equation for cell respiration. Sugars, again, you could put glucose here, plus oxygen is going to release CO2 as a waste product. We exhale, as humans, we exhale CO2, we get rid of it, plus water, and then you have energy. Now, decomposers, that's another group of heterotrophs that have the ability to break down dead and decaying organisms in order to make their energy. Now, the last objective we're going to look at is objective number 10. I'm briefly going to go over this, what procedures and terminology are used to test a hypothesis using the scientific method. I wanted you to see what the scientific method looks like. Scientists, including biologists, we ask questions. We try to develop hypotheses. Then we make predictions. And then we start to collect data by careful observation and experimentation. Many folks have seen this. This is the steps, the basic steps for the scientific method. Very, very quickly, we'll go over some of these. Observation, just giving kind of some initial observations of the question at hand, and then formulating some kind of question about the situation, creating a hypothesis. This is, everybody knows, as an educated guess. It is educated, so you have to study the situation first, use that information to formulate a hypothesis. Create a testable prediction. In other words, come up with a test. How are you going to test your hypothesis? Come up with a test, and then complete your experiment, look at your data, draw your conclusions. One of the first labs that you'll complete this week is on the scientific method. And so read over this section that deals with the scientific method, and then whenever you go through the lab, it's going to explain even more details on the scientific method for you. This concludes this portion of the lecture. And like I said, go back, read over the chapter. It's a pretty easy reading chapter. Go over the chapter, complete the MindTap assignments, and watch the other YouTube videos that I posted to Moodle for a little background information as well. Thank you.